Chapter 1. The Prophesies Before His Birth. The story of Alexander the Great often begins with his dazzling campaigns, his sweeping conquests, and his legendary charisma. But to truly understand the man, one must first wander slowly back in time to the world before his birth. His story, as the ancient people told it, was surrounded by strange omens, peculiar dreams, and wild prophecies that made his arrival seem more like the descent of a figure from myth than the birth of an ordinary child. And so, if we are to explore the craziest facts about Alexander, we must begin at this strange and shadowy point in history, where myth and reality blurred so completely that even the people who lived in those days could not always tell the difference. In the middle of the 4th century before our era, Macedonia was still considered by many Greeks to be something of a backwater kingdom. Athens, Thebes, and Sparta prided themselves on philosophy, literature, and military discipline. To them, Macedon was a rough land of warriors, hunters, and kings who lived closer to their horses and their battlefields than to the lecture halls of philosophy. Yet out of this rugged kingdom, one of the most extraordinary figures of all time would emerge. His birth, people said, was not ordinary. His arrival in the world was surrounded by signs that spoke of greatness, of danger, and of a destiny larger than life itself. Alexander's mother was Olympias, a woman from Epirus, a neighboring land known for its oracles and its ancient traditions. Olympias was no ordinary queen. She was deeply religious, immersed in the cult of the gods, and was even rumored to take part in secret rites of Dionysus, the god of wine, frenzy, and ecstatic visions. People whispered that she kept sacred snakes in her chambers, letting them coil around her body during ceremonies. Whether this was true or only gossip is impossible to say with certainty, but it reveals the aura of strangeness that surrounded her even before her son was born. To later storytellers, she was more than a queen. She was a woman chosen to carry the child of destiny. One of the strangest facts about Alexander's early story comes from the night of his conception, or at least, from the myths that grew around it. Ancient sources claimed that Olympias dreamed of a thunderbolt striking her womb, filling it with fire and light. When she awoke, she told this vision to the priests, who declared that the dream foretold the birth of a son whose nature would be as fierce and brilliant as lightning itself. At the same time, Philip of Macedon, Alexander's father, had a dream of his own. In his vision, he placed a seal upon his wife's womb, and that seal bore the image of a lion. The dream interpreters told him that this meant he would father a son as strong and ferocious as the king of beasts. These two dreams, shared by husband and wife, were woven together by the storytellers of antiquity into a prophecy of greatness. Yet the strangest part of this story was the rumor that spread afterward, that Zeus, the king of the gods, had been the true father of Alexander. For the Greeks, such tales were not unusual. Heroes of old, like Hercules, were said to be the sons of gods and mortals. But in Alexander's case, the rumor took on a special intensity. It was said that on the very night he was conceived, a great peal of thunder shook the heavens, as though Zeus himself had descended to embrace Olympias. Some stories claimed that Philip never truly believed Alexander was his own child, suspecting instead that his wife had consorted with the divine. Others insisted that Olympias herself whispered this into her son's ear, convincing him from boyhood that he was not merely mortal. Whether true or not, these stories followed him all his life, and Alexander himself often encouraged them, allowing people to think of him as more than human. The night of Alexander's actual birth, in the summer of 356 BCE, was remembered as one of the strangest nights in memory. Ancient writers filled it with wild coincidences and omens that made it seem as if the entire world had paused to mark the arrival of this child. They said that at the very moment Olympias gave birth, far away in Greece, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the wonders of the ancient world, was consumed by fire. Some took this as a terrible omen, a sign that the goddess was too distracted with the birth of a new hero to protect her sacred temple. Others interpreted it differently, saying that the destruction of the temple showed that a force of destiny far greater than any god's shrine had entered the world. It was as if the universe itself demanded a sign. Other signs were also remembered. That same night, Philip's armies won a great victory, securing Macedon's strength. People marveled at the coincidence, a child of destiny, a triumph in battle, and a burning wonder of the world, all at once. The poets and storytellers of later centuries embroidered these tales until they shone with a mythical glow, turning Alexander's birth into an event as strange and fateful as the coming of any legendary hero. When Alexander was just a newborn, seers were summoned to interpret the omens. One of them declared, with unusual certainty, that the child would one day be invincible, and that his destiny was to conquer the world. Imagine the effect of such words on the court. In a land where prophecy was taken with deadly seriousness, this was no small claim. From the very beginning of his life, Alexander was treated as someone set apart. While other infants were cradled gently and sung to sleep, Alexander's earliest lullabies were words about destiny, empire, and glory. But even more curious were the little details that people remembered about him as a baby and a child. His eyes, it was said, were not alike. Some claimed that one was dark and the other light, or that one seemed to shine with a more piercing brightness. The Greeks often saw heterochromia, a difference in eye color, as a mark of divine favor, and so this little peculiarity became another crazy factor about him, another sign that he was not quite like other children. Olympias, meanwhile, nurtured the belief that her son was extraordinary. She told him stories of Achilles, the hero of the Trojan War, and she told him that he was descended from that same line. Whether through truth or through the imagination of a devoted mother, these tales were whispered into his ears long before he could fully understand them. They sank into his heart and shaped the way he thought of himself. For Alexander, from the earliest age, life was not about being ordinary. It was about stepping into the role of a hero written into the fabric of fate. All these stories, the thunderbolt dream, the lion seal, the burning temple, the unmatched eyes, make his birth one of the strangest and most legendary in all of history. But it is important to move slowly through them, to sit with each one, because the people of his time did not think of them as amusing coincidences or idle gossip. They thought of them as real signs, proof that the boy who had just been born would grow into something more than a man. And in a way, they were right. For all their strangeness, these stories prepared the stage for what was to come. And so, the first chapter of Alexander's life was not one of action but of prophecy. A boy born into omens and myths, cradled in stories of divine power, watched by a kingdom that whispered about what he might become. This was the foundation of the legend, the beginning of a story so vast and strange that it continues to astonish the world more than 2,000 years later. Chapter 2: Childhood Oddities. When Alexander was born into a world of omens and prophecies, people already whispered that he was no ordinary child. But the strangeness of his life did not end with his birth. In fact, as he grew from an infant into a boy, the odd details, the unusual habits, and the extraordinary little stories multiplied, until those around him could not help but believe that he was being shaped by something greater than the world of mortals. His childhood, far from being ordinary, became a series of small but curious events that seemed to foreshadow the destiny he would one day claim. Let us imagine the young Alexander in the palace of Peller, the capital of Macedonia. The palace was not like the grand marble halls of Athens or the glittering palaces of Persia. It was more rugged, more practical, a place built for kings who were warriors as much as rulers. Its courtyards smelled of horses, for the Macedonians loved their cavalry above all things. Its walls echoed with the sound of weapons, for soldiers were always training nearby. Alexander was not raised in softness. From his earliest years, he was surrounded by the sounds and sights of war. And yet, what struck those who saw him was not only the environment around him, but his own fierce personality. As a child, Alexander was said to have been stubborn to a remarkable degree. Other children could be coaxed, bribed, or frightened into obedience, but Alexander had a will that seemed unbending even at a young age. If he desired something, he pursued it with an intensity that startled his caretakers. If he disliked something, no amount of persuasion could bend him. This stubbornness, which might have been seen as a flaw in another boy, was interpreted as a sign of greatness in him. For in the ancient world, unbending willpower was the mark of a hero. There are countless small stories preserved about the young Alexander, but perhaps the most famous and strangest of them all involves a horse named Bucephalus. The tale was told and retold by ancient writers, and while the details may have grown with each telling, the heart of the story reveals much about Alexander's unusual nature as a boy. Bucephalus was a magnificent animal, a great black horse brought before King Philip as a gift. Yet the horse was wild and unmanageable. No man could ride him. The strongest soldiers tried, but Bucephalus threw them off or bolted in fear. He seemed untamable, and Philip was ready to dismiss the gift as worthless. But Alexander, who was only 12 years old at the time, watched the scene carefully. He noticed something peculiar. The horse seemed to shy away at his own shadow. The great beast, feared by all, was terrified of something as insubstantial as darkness on the ground. Young Alexander stepped forward and declared that he could tame the horse. The adults around him laughed, for what could a boy do that grown men could not? But Alexander insisted, and Philip, amused, gave him the chance. The boy approached the horse calmly, speaking softly, and turned the animal toward the sun so that its shadow lay behind it. At once, the horse grew calmer. Then, with confidence beyond his years, Alexander mounted Bucephalus and rode him across the field. When he returned, triumphant, the crowd was astonished. King Philip himself, overwhelmed with pride and amazement, is said to have exclaimed, "My son, seek out a kingdom equal to yourself, for Macedonia is too small for you." It was a dramatic statement, but one that captured the spirit of the moment. In taming Bucephalus, Alexander had shown not only courage and skill, but also an unusual way of seeing the world. He noticed details others missed, and he acted with a calmness that belied his age. The story was retold for centuries as proof that even as a boy, Alexander was destined to master not only animals and men, but perhaps the whole world. But this was not the only strange thing about Alexander as a child. He displayed an obsession with the heroes of old. His favorite was Achilles, the legendary warrior of the Trojan War. He read Homer's Iliad with passion, and he did not simply admire Achilles from a distance. He longed to be like him. It was said that Alexander kept a copy of the Iliad under his pillow at night, and that he slept with it beside his sword. Imagine a boy so young, yet already convinced that his life was to mirror that of the greatest hero in myth. This is not the behavior of an ordinary child. It is a window into a mind that was already consumed with destiny. Alexander also showed an unusual seriousness about glory and honor. Most boys his age were content with games, but Alexander turned even his play into a rehearsal for greatness. When he and his friends staged mock battles, Alexander always took the role of general or hero, never a common soldier. And when others laughed and played for amusement, he often grew frustrated if the games did not reflect real challenges of war or leadership. From the earliest age, he seemed unable to separate himself from the idea of greatness. His teachers noticed this too. One of them, Leonidas, who was related to Alexander's mother, tried to instill discipline in him. Leonidas was stern, and often tried to limit the boy's desires. Once, when Alexander offered lavish sacrifices to the gods, Leonidas scolded him for wasting so much incense. "When you have conquered the spice lands," he said, "you can burn as much as you like." Years later, when Alexander did conquer those lands, He sent Leonidas a letter saying he had fulfilled the promise and included a great supply of incense as a gift. Even as a child, Alexander's actions seemed to foreshadow the vast ambitions of his future. Another strange fact about Alexander's childhood was his unusual love of knowledge. He was not content only with military training, though that was a central part of his upbringing. He was also fascinated by philosophy, science, and stories of distant lands. When Aristotle later became his tutor, Alexander devoured knowledge of plants, animals, and medicine. But even before Aristotle, he showed a curiosity that was unusual for a boy of his station. While other young princes might have cared only for hunting and feasting, Alexander wanted to understand the world. At the same time, he was quick-tempered. There are stories of his anger flaring at the smallest slight. Once, as a boy, he entertained Persian envoys who came to visit his father. Instead of being shy or deferential, Alexander boldly questioned them about the farthest reaches of Persia, about its armies, its kings, and its strange customs. The Persians were astonished that a mere child spoke to them with the authority of a ruler. But behind this confidence lay a temper that could easily burn into rage if he felt disrespected. This volatility, this sudden swing between calm intelligence and fiery passion, was another odd trait that marked him from youth. And then there was his physicality. Alexander was not especially tall. In fact, he was shorter than many of his companions. But his presence was extraordinary. People remarked on the intensity of his gaze. He carried himself with a certain authority that seemed to make him larger than he was. Combined with his distinctive mismatched eyes, this gave him an air of mystery. Even as a child, he did not look quite like others, and he certainly did not act like them. All these little details, his stubborn will, his taming of Bucephalus, his obsession with heroes, his fiery temper, his unusual seriousness, formed a childhood that was anything but ordinary. If most children grow slowly into their identity, Alexander seemed to have stepped into his from the beginning. He was, in a sense, always playing the role of the future king, even before he wore a crown. The people around him could not help but notice. Servants whispered about his peculiar habits. Courtiers remarked on his strange intelligence. And Philip, his father, though often stern and practical, recognized that his son was not like other boys. Perhaps this recognition filled Philip with both pride and unease, for to raise a child destined for greatness is not always a blessing. Greatness often comes with danger, and Alexander's fiery spirit was as likely to burn those around him as it was to illuminate them. And so, as Alexander grew, the oddities of his childhood became the foundation for his legend. He was a boy who tamed the untamable, who idolized ancient heroes, who questioned foreign envoys with the confidence of a king, who kept Homer under his pillow and dreamed of glory before he could even grow a beard. He was a boy shaped by myth, by destiny, and by the strange conviction that his life was never meant to be ordinary. Chapter 3. His teacher Aristotle and strange lessons. If the omens and prophecies at his birth set Alexander apart, and if his childhood gave hints of the restless fire within him, then his education under one of the greatest minds of the ancient world carved those traits into something sharper. For while Alexander was born into a kingdom of warriors, his father Philip did not want his son to grow up knowing only the ways of the sword. He wanted him to have the mind of a king as well as the arm of a soldier. And so he brought into Alexander's life a teacher whose name is remembered as clearly as the pupils, Aristotle. It is almost unbelievable to think of it now. The greatest conqueror of the ancient world, taught in his youth by one of the greatest philosophers of all time. History rarely produces such coincidences, and when it does, legends are born. Yet even within this legendary pairing, the stories that survive are filled with curious details, strange lessons, and unexpected habits that reveal much about Alexander's unusual character. Aristotle was already famous when he was invited to Macedon. He had studied under Plato himself in Athens, and though he disagreed with his teacher on many things, he carried with him the authority of a man who had walked among the brightest thinkers of Greece. He was not simply a scholar, but a man of vast curiosity, studying animals, plants, politics, medicine, and the very nature of knowledge itself. When Philip asked him to take charge of his son's education, Aristotle agreed, and the young Alexander was sent to study under his guidance at a place called Mieser, where a quiet sanctuary had been prepared for the royal children. The first strange thing about Alexander's education was how broad it was. Most young nobles in Greece or Macedon might learn to read and write, to recite poetry, to train in weapons, and to speak persuasively. But under Aristotle, Alexander's studies expanded into almost every subject imaginable. He was taught philosophy, ethics, politics, and the search for truth. He was taught science, learning about animals, plants, and the stars. He was taught medicine, so that throughout his life he often prescribed treatments for his soldiers, astonishing those around him. He even studied foreign customs, history, and geography. For Aristotle believed that knowledge itself was a kind of power, and that a king who ruled the world must understand it. But what is especially strange, and what makes this part of Alexander's life so fascinating, is how he received these lessons. Alexander was not a passive student. He absorbed knowledge with an intensity that startled even his teacher. He did not merely listen. He questioned, debated, and argued. Some stories tell us that he would press Aristotle with difficult questions, challenging his answers, refusing to accept easy explanations. Even as a boy, Alexander treated his teacher not simply as a master to be obeyed, but as an intellectual sparring partner. This fiery spirit was both a gift and a danger. It showed his sharpness of mind, but it also revealed the pride that would later lead him to clash with his generals, his friends, and even with the traditions of Greece itself. One of the strangest lessons Aristotle gave Alexander was about the difference between Greeks and non-Greeks. Aristotle taught him that the Greeks were a people of culture and reason, while the rest of the world were barbarians fit only to be ruled. This lesson sank deeply into Alexander, though with a twist. For while Alexander certainly embraced the idea of Greek superiority in his youth, as a conqueror he would later blur the lines between Greek and foreigner, adopting customs from Persia and Egypt, and marrying across cultures. This was one of the many contradictions in him, the boy who listened eagerly to Aristotle's divisions, and the man who later tried to unite the world into one. Another curious part of his education was his love of books. While Aristotle may have instilled this habit, Alexander carried it much further than most men of his age. He read not only poetry and philosophy, but also histories, plays, and works of science. The story is often told that when he set out on his great campaigns, one of the items he kept with him was a small chest filled with books, treasured works that he read even in the dust and noise of war. In fact, he was said to have slept with Homer's Iliad beside him, annotated by Aristotle himself. Imagine the conqueror of the known world, sleeping under the open sky on campaign, yet keeping his book of Homer as carefully as his sword. It is one of the strangest and most human facts about him, that the boy who longed to be Achilles also longed to keep Homer's voice close at hand, even in the chaos of battle. Medicine, too, was a peculiar focus of his education. Unlike many kings, who might rely solely on their physicians, Alexander studied remedies and treatments himself. Later in life, he would examine plants, roots, and minerals, speaking of their properties with surprising authority. He prescribed cures for his companions and even mixed medicines with his own hands. This was unusual, for it blurred the line between king and healer. Yet it also gave him a practical knowledge that may have saved lives on his long marches through deserts, mountains, and jungles. And yet, for all his brilliance as a student, Alexander's lessons also revealed his darker side. Aristotle tried to instill in him the virtues of moderation, of balance, of reason guiding passion. But Alexander's nature was too fiery to be fully tempered. While he loved philosophy, he loved glory more. While he admired reason, he burned with a desire to act, to conquer, to make the world remember his name. The philosopher may have guided the prince, but the warrior within him could never be silenced. There is also the strange fact of their relationship later in life. As Alexander grew into a conqueror, he began to see himself less as the pupil of Aristotle and more as his equal, or even his superior. He once declared that he owed his father Philip the gift of life, but he owed Aristotle the gift of living well. Yet for all this praise, he sometimes clashed with Aristotle's teachings, especially when it came to how foreigners should be treated. Where Aristotle spoke of separation, Alexander dreamed of unity. Where Aristotle saw differences, Alexander sought to blend cultures. This divergence is one of the strangest ironies of history, that the student who learned so much from the philosopher also turned away from him in key ways, forging a path that his teacher might never have approved of. And yet, without Aristotle, it is hard to imagine Alexander as we know him. The curiosity that led him to explore distant lands, the habit of questioning that made him bold, the love of learning that accompanied him even on campaign, all these were shaped in those early years at Mieza. It was there, under the eye of Aristotle, that the restless boy with mismatched eyes was molded into a prince who carried not only the sword of a conqueror, but the mind of a philosopher king. So when we think of Alexander the Great, charging into battle, or gazing at the endless horizons of Asia, or holding court in the palaces of Persia, we must remember that behind the warrior was also the student. A student of one of the greatest teachers of all time, and a man whose strangest and most curious traits were nurtured not only by prophecy and ambition, but by lessons in philosophy, science, and knowledge itself. Chapter 4: The Craziest Battles of His Life. When we speak of Alexander the Great, it is impossible to separate his life from his battles. He was, after all, a man who built his entire reputation, his empire, and his legend on the edge of a sword. Yet what makes his battles worth retelling, especially in the quiet of the night, is not only their scale or their bloodshed, but the sheer strangeness of them. For again and again, Alexander found himself facing impossible odds, overwhelming enemies, or unusual situations, and somehow, through cunning, courage, or sheer force of will, he emerged victorious. To understand these battles, one must first remember the kind of world he lived in. War in the 4th century BCE was brutal and direct. Armies marched on foot, often with little food, their strength carried in their spears, their shields, and their discipline. Cavalry was a prized weapon, but it was the phalanx, the wall of spears, that formed the backbone of Greek and Macedonian warfare. Battles were usually decided in a single day, in a single clash, as men pushed against men, shield against shield, until one side broke. And yet, into this harsh world, Alexander brought a strange kind of genius, a willingness to experiment, to improvise, and to use his enemies' size and strength against them. This was what made his battles so extraordinary. Let us begin with the first great test of his generalship, the Battle of the Granicus. It was fought in 334 BCE, when Alexander first crossed into Asia. He was only 22 years old, and yet he was about to challenge the Persian Empire, the greatest power of the known world. The Persian king, Darius III, commanded resources that dwarfed those of Macedon. His armies were vast, his lands stretched from the Aegean Sea to the mountains of India, and his wealth was beyond measure. Most men would have hesitated, but Alexander plunged forward. At the Granicus River, he faced a Persian force drawn up on the opposite bank. The Persians thought themselves secure, for the river was swift and its banks were steep. No sane commander, they believed, would try to charge across under fire. But Alexander did the insane. He ordered his cavalry to plunge into the river and attack the enemy head-on. The water rose to their chests, arrows rained down upon them, and the Persians, waiting on the high ground, cut at them as they scrambled up the bank. It should have been a disaster. And yet, Alexander, at the very front, fought with such ferocity that his men rallied. He was struck on the head by an axe, nearly killed, but his helmet deflected the blow. Dragged from danger by his companions, he surged forward again. Slowly, incredibly, the Persians broke. The Macedonians gained the far bank, and the enemy fled. It was madness, and yet it worked. This was one of the first crazy facts about Alexander's battles. Again and again, he attempted the impossible, and somehow made it succeed. The next great battle was at Issus, in 333 BCE. Here the odds were even more daunting. Darius himself commanded a vast Persian army, said to be several times the size of Alexander's. The two forces met in a narrow coastal plain, hemmed in by the sea on one side and mountains on the other. The Persians had numbers, but their sheer size worked against them in the cramped space. Alexander, recognizing this, struck like a thunderbolt. He led his cavalry in a furious charge directly at Darius's position. The young king of Persia, seeing Alexander thundering toward him, panicked. Before the eyes of his army, he turned his chariot and fled. The Persians, watching their king abandon the field, collapsed in fear. In that single moment, Alexander won not only the battle but the loyalty of many Greeks who had doubted him. What is strange about Issus is not only the victory, but the aftermath. Alexander captured the family of Darius, the queen, the princesses, the royal children. They expected cruelty, humiliation, perhaps even death. Instead, Alexander treated them with honor. He bowed to them, comforted them, and even declared that they should be respected as royalty, for he considered himself already their new king. This was not normal behavior for a conqueror. It was strange, shocking, and it helped build the myth that Alexander was not just another warlord, but a figure chosen by the gods. Then came Gaugamela, perhaps the most famous of all Alexander's battles, fought in 331 BCE. Here, the Persians gathered everything they had. Darius assembled an army said to number in the hundreds of thousands, drawn from every corner of his empire: Persians, Medes, Bactrians, Scythians, Indians with elephants, Armenians with horsemen, and even war chariots with scythed blades attached to their wheels, designed to mow down men in droves. Against this vast host, Alexander commanded a force of perhaps 40,000. It should have been hopeless. But Alexander studied the ground carefully. The plain had been flattened by Darius's men to allow his chariots to charge. Alexander, instead of facing them head-on, stretched his line diagonally, drawing part of the Persian army away from the center. Then, at the perfect moment, he and his cavalry launched a wedge-shaped charge directly at Darius himself. Once again, the Persian king lost his nerve. Seeing Alexander bearing down upon him, he fled the field. His massive army, left leaderless, collapsed into chaos. The Macedonians slaughtered thousands, and Alexander stood victorious. The crazy fact about Gaugamela is not only that Alexander won against such overwhelming odds, but that he did so with such precision, as if he had rehearsed it 100 times. He turned the massive size of the Persian army into a weakness, pulling it apart and then striking at its heart. It was genius, but it was also reckless. Had the timing been even slightly off, his smaller force would have been swallowed. Yet Alexander never hesitated. To him, risk was simply the stage on which glory could be won. And then there was India. By this time, Alexander had marched farther than any Greek before him. His men were exhausted, yet he pressed on into lands filled with strange sights and stranger dangers. At the Hydaspes River in 326 BCE, he faced King Porus of India, a ruler who brought war elephants to the battlefield. To the Macedonians, who had never faced such beasts. The sight was terrifying. The elephants towered above them, armored and painted, trumpeting as they charged. Many believed the Macedonians would be crushed underfoot. But Alexander devised a plan. He led part of his army upstream in the dark of night, crossed the river secretly, and fell upon Porus from the flank at dawn. The battle that followed was fierce and bloody. The elephants trampled men, gored horses, and spread terror, but the Macedonians adapted. They cut the elephants' tendons, wounded their mahouts, and slowly turned the tide. Porus himself fought bravely, refusing to yield, even when wounded. At last, Alexander won, but what is strangest of all is how he treated his defeated enemy. Instead of killing him, Alexander asked him how he wished to be treated. Porus replied simply, like a king. Alexander, impressed by his courage, not only spared him but made him an ally, granting him more territory than he had lost. This was one of the strangest facts of Alexander's campaigns, that he often showed magnanimity to defeated kings, treating them as brothers rather than enemies, as though he saw in them a reflection of himself. Each of these battles, Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, Hydaspes, was not only a military engagement but a story of audacity, of risk, and of strange outcomes. Again and again, Alexander defied the logic of numbers, the expectations of generals, and even the laws of chance. He charged rivers, faced armies many times his size, fought elephants with men who had never seen them before, and always emerged victorious. It was madness, and yet it worked. And what makes these stories even more curious is how Alexander himself behaved in them. He never commanded from the rear, as many kings did. He was always at the front, leading the charge, taking the first blow, risking his life again and again. This was not strategy, it was theater. Alexander wanted to be seen, wanted his men to believe that he was invincible, that the gods themselves protected him. And somehow, through a mixture of skill, luck, and sheer will, he seemed to prove it. When we look back on these battles today, they seem almost unbelievable. How could one man, with a small army, defeat the might of Persia, cross mountains and deserts, and triumph even against elephants? And yet, the records are clear. Alexander did these things. The crazy fact is not only that he did them, but that he made them seem inevitable, as though the world itself bent to his daring. And so, his battles were more than wars. They were performances of destiny, staged upon the fields of Asia, with Alexander as both actor and director, striding into the impossible and emerging as legend. Chapter 5. His weird relationship with his men. The story of Alexander the Great cannot be told without pausing to look closely at his soldiers, those men who followed him across mountains, deserts, rivers, and endless battlefields, far away from their homes in Macedonia and Greece. And deep into lands most of them had never even heard of before they were marched there. His army was not only the engine of his conquests, it was the mirror that reflected his own contradictions, loyalty and cruelty, closeness and distance, love and fear. Alexander's relationship with his men was unlike that of most kings and commanders in history. It was strange, unpredictable, and at times even bizarre. It created a bond so strong that it carried them all to the edge of the known world, and yet so fragile that it nearly broke apart again and again along the way. When Alexander first took the throne, he inherited an army that already adored his father Philip. These were tough, scarred men who had marched and fought under Philip's reforms, who had turned Macedonia from a poor and fractured land into a military powerhouse. They were not gentle men. They were farmers turned warriors, hardened by years of training in the phalanx, their lives built around discipline and blood. For a young man like Alexander to suddenly stand above them as their king might have seemed impossible. He was, after all, just 20 years old when Philip was assassinated. But Alexander did something remarkable. He did not stay distant from them. He did not sit in palaces while they marched. From the very beginning, he walked into their world and showed that he could suffer as they suffered. One of the strangest features of this relationship was how much Alexander deliberately blurred the line between king and soldier. On campaign, he often dressed more like his men than like a monarch. He wore armor and dust on his face, and in sieges he would take part in the same dangers they did. At Tyre, when the city resisted him, Alexander himself climbed the siege ladders, fighting alongside his men, exposed to arrows and stones that could have killed him. When a man of such high rank risked his life in the same mud and blood as the common soldier, it was both inspiring and unsettling. Inspiring, because the soldiers saw their leader as one of them. Unsettling, because they also knew their king's life was too precious to be gambled in such a reckless way. Yet Alexander did not care. He wanted his men to feel that he was not above the same dangers, and this created a fierce loyalty that most kings never knew. But loyalty in Alexander's army was not built only on courage and shared hardship. It was built also on the long nights of drinking, on the feasts that began in joy and sometimes ended in blood. Alexander, unlike many rulers, was not content to eat and drink apart from his companions. He wanted to sit among them, to drink with them, to talk and argue and laugh. These feasts were not small affairs. After a victory, wine flowed like rivers. Huge cups were passed around, songs were sung, and soldiers told stories of their bravery. In these moments, Alexander was not a distant monarch but the center of a circle of men, each competing to show loyalty, wit, or courage. But with wine came recklessness, and Alexander's temper was as famous as his charm. One of the strangest and saddest facts about Alexander's relationship with his men is that in these drunken feasts, bonds of friendship could suddenly snap. The most famous example was Cletus the Black, an older officer who had once saved Alexander's life in battle. Cletus had fought loyally for years, and Alexander trusted him. But during a drinking contest, tempers flared. Cletus, drunk, began insulting Alexander, reminding him that his victories were possible only because of the soldiers who fought for him. Alexander, equally drunk and furious, grabbed a spear and struck Cletus dead on the spot. His men were horrified. They had seen their king laugh with Cletus hours earlier, and now they saw him murder his friend in rage. Alexander himself was devastated afterward, but the damage was done. It showed his men that loyalty and friendship with him could be both life-giving and dangerously fragile. This strange mix of closeness and fear defined his army's view of him. On one hand, he shared their thirst, their hunger, their exhaustion. He marched at the front when crossing deserts, refusing to take a sip of water if his men had none. There is a story that once, when his troops were nearly dead of thirst in the hot dust of the Jedrosian desert, a small group of soldiers found a helmet filled with water and brought it to Alexander. Everyone watched to see what he would do. He looked at the water, then poured it onto the ground in front of them. He said he would not drink when his men could not. The act stunned the army. Some wept. They felt that their king was truly sharing in their suffering, and this deepened their loyalty more than if he had drunk it. And yet, the same man who refused water could also demand godlike worship from them. As Alexander marched deeper into Asia, he began to embrace the idea that he was not just a king but something divine. In Egypt, the priests declared him the son of the god Ammon. When this story spread among his troops, some believed it, others mocked it. But Alexander himself began to act as if it were true. He asked his men to bow before him in the Persian style, touching their heads to the ground in an act called proskynesis. For Greeks and Macedonians, this was shocking. Only gods received such honors. His men resisted. Some even refused outright, whispering that their king was becoming arrogant, even mad. Alexander was furious, but he could not force every soldier to obey. This tension, between their admiration for him as a mortal leader and his demand to be worshipped as divine, created one of the strangest cracks in their bond. The punishments he dealt out also baffled his men. At times he was astonishingly forgiving. A soldier might insult him in anger, and Alexander would laugh it off, quarreling at the wine talking. He could even forgive enemies who had fought against him, rewarding their bravery instead of killing them. But at other times, he punished his men with savage cruelty. A soldier caught stealing might be executed. Entire units might be shamed or humiliated for disobedience. Once, when a group of soldiers mutinied because they were too exhausted to march farther, Alexander stood before them and gave a long, furious speech. He reminded them of all the victories they had won, of all the lands they had conquered, and then declared that he would march on alone if they did not want to follow him. The soldiers broke down in tears. They realized their king would rather risk his life alone than retreat with them. In the end, they begged to go with him. Perhaps the strangest of all was the way Alexander could inspire his men with both love and fear at the same time. They adored him for sharing in their hardships, for being brave in battle, for refusing comforts when they had none. But they also feared his unpredictable temper, his sudden rages, and his godlike demands. This combination created a kind of spell. His men could not leave him. They grumbled, they mutinied, they argued, but when Alexander called, they followed. They followed him into India, into battles against war elephants, into jungles and rivers that none of them had ever imagined. They followed because his presence was magnetic. To be near Alexander was to feel part of something larger than life, even if it might also mean sudden death. And so, when we speak of Alexander's a weirder relationship with his men, it was more than just strange habits or violent feasts. It was a relationship built on contradictions. He was their king but also their companion. He was their fellow sufferer but also a man who demanded worship. He was generous and cruel, forgiving and merciless, inspiring and terrifying. These contradictions kept his men bound to him in ways that no ordinary bond could. They were not simply soldiers serving a king. They were companions caught in the orbit of a man who seemed at times human, at times god, at times monster. And through this strange, unpredictable bond, Alexander carried them farther than any army had ever gone before. Chapter 6: The Strange Cities He Built. Alexander had a strange habit that bewildered both his friends and his enemies. Everywhere he marched, he wanted to leave behind a city that bore his name. It was not enough for him to conquer the cities of others. He felt compelled to plant new ones, as if by doing so he could stamp his presence permanently onto the world itself. By the end of his short life, more than 20 places scattered across Asia carried the name Alexandria. Some were small garrisons, little more than fortified towns, while others would grow into great cities that lasted for centuries. The most famous of them all was Alexandria in Egypt, a shining city by the sea, where Greek thought and Egyptian tradition mingled to form something entirely new. But to understand the strangeness of Alexander's cities, one must imagine not their later grandeur, but their beginnings. Picture the great conqueror riding across a plain, dust rising around the hooves of his horse Bucephalus, the hot wind pressing against his bronze helmet. His army trudges behind, thousands of men weary from marching but still attentive, still expectant. Suddenly Alexander halts, looks toward a riverbank, a mountain pass, or a natural harbor, and declares in his sharp, commanding voice that here, in this place that moments ago was nothing but wilderness, a city will be born. His officers exchange glances, for they know what this means. Weeks of labor, soldiers digging foundations, erecting wooden palisades, and marking out streets in straight lines, all under the watchful eye of their king. These Alexandrias were not simply vanity projects, though vanity was certainly part of the story. They were strategic, carefully positioned along trade routes and supply lines, each one a link in the vast chain of his empire. Some guarded rivers. Others anchored newly conquered provinces. Still others served as way stations for further campaigns, a promise that Alexander intended not merely to pass through but to remain. Yet the strangeness of it all lay in how obsessively he repeated the pattern. Imagine marching with him for months through heat and dust, only to hear him once again cry out, "Here! Another Alexandria!" Until the very name seemed to echo endlessly across Asia. The soldiers sometimes joked about it. They wondered aloud how people back in Greece would react if they heard of 20 Alexandrias springing up across the world. Would travelers become hopelessly lost, unable to tell one Alexandria from another? Would mothers in faraway towns scold their children by saying, "Be careful, or Alexander will build another Alexandria in our fields, eh?" The jokes softened the burden of endless construction, but beneath the humor lay a deeper recognition. These cities were part of his strange vision of empire. He did not simply wish to conquer. He wished to transform the land itself, to make it Greek, to leave his presence carved into the very soil. Some of the cities had unusual origins. In Bactria, far from Greece, Alexander founded a city for soldiers who had grown weary and longed to stay behind. They had marched for years, their bodies scarred by battle, their spirits worn thin. Rather than punish them for wanting to rest, Alexander gave them a city. It was both a reward and a way of ensuring loyalty, a city built not only of stone and wood but of obligation, for those who stayed behind owed their lives and land to him. In another case, he built a city for veterans and their families, a settlement where Greek customs mingled with local traditions, producing a strange fusion of cultures that had never before existed. And then there was Alexandria in Egypt, perhaps the strangest of all. When Alexander arrived on the northern coast of Egypt, he gazed out at the glittering Mediterranean and saw a narrow strip of land between sea and lake. Most men would have passed by, but Alexander saw destiny in that place. He ordered a city to be built there, a city that would connect Greece and Egypt, Europe and Africa, west and east. The local builders lacked chalk to mark the streets, so they used flour instead, sprinkling it on the ground to sketch the grid of the new city. Birds swooped down and ate the flour, and many took it as a bad omen, but Alexander, always confident, declared it a sign of abundance, proof that the city would one day feed multitudes. Alexandria in Egypt became more than a city. It became an idea, a crossroads of cultures. Greek philosophers walked its streets alongside Egyptian priests, Jewish scholars, and traders from distant lands. Centuries later, its great library would attempt to gather all the world's knowledge under one roof. And all of it began with Alexander's peculiar obsession, his desire to build, to leave behind something lasting, even as he himself marched ever forward, never stopping long enough to enjoy what he had created. But what was truly strange was not simply the building of cities, but the way Alexander imagined them as mirrors of himself. Each Alexandria was, in his mind, a reflection, a piece of his identity scattered across the map. To conquer land was not enough. He had to rename it, to mold it, to make it carry his essence. It was as if he believed that by stamping his name on stone and soil, he could make himself immortal. The sword could win battles, but the city could endure centuries. This duality, destruction and creation, defined Alexander's paradoxical nature. He burned ancient capitals like Persepolis in drunken rage, and then only months later, he laid the foundation of a new Alexandria with meticulous care. The soldiers felt the weight of this paradox. They marched through smoking ruins one day and dug the earth for new streets the next. They began to see their king not only as a warrior but as a strange kind of builder, an architect of dreams that few could fully understand. Some grumbled that they were becoming masons instead of fighters, laborious instead of heroes. Yet others saw the wisdom in it, for these cities offered a chance of permanence, a hope that their wandering would one day give way to stability. Still, most of them suspected that Alexander himself never truly sought stability. For him, The cities were not endings but markers, signposts along the endless road of conquest. As the army marched deeper into Asia, the Alexandrias multiplied. In deserts, in valleys, along rivers, and at the edge of mountains, they sprang up like echoes of their king's ambition. Some would vanish into dust within decades, forgotten by history, their walls crumbling into the earth. But others would endure, becoming centers of trade, culture, and power. Long after Alexander was gone, travelers would arrive in distant lands, hear the name Alexandria, and be reminded of the strange conqueror who seemed determined to scatter himself across the world. Chapter 7. The Restless March East. The strange thing about Alexander the Great was not only how much he conquered, but how restless he remained in the face of his victories. For most generals, the capture of Persia, the downfall of Darius, and the control of Babylon, Persepolis, and Susa would have been more than enough to secure eternal fame. Yet Alexander was not most generals. For him, each success only deepened his hunger for more. Each horizon he reached seemed only to remind him of another horizon beyond. His soldiers had followed him loyally through deserts and mountains, across rivers, and into battles that seemed unwinnable. They had marched thousands of miles from Macedon, through Asia Minor, down into Egypt, back across Mesopotamia, and now, far into the eastern territories of the Persian Empire. Many of them were tired, worn down not just by fighting but by endless walking, endless moving, endless chasing of a dream that was Alexander's alone. Yet Alexander pressed them forward still, driven by a vision of empire that stretched further than any of them could imagine. By the time he turned his eyes eastward, Alexander was in his late 20s. That fact alone is staggering. In less than a decade of campaigning, he had transformed himself from a Macedonian prince into the ruler of the largest empire the world had yet seen. And yet, for Alexander, it was not enough. The maps of his time still showed lands unexplored, peoples unconquered, mysteries unsolved. India especially loomed in his imagination, a vast and strange land, filled with rumors of mighty kings, war elephants, and philosophies unlike anything the Greeks had known. To reach it became his new obsession. The march eastward began slowly, almost cautiously. His armies had just absorbed the riches of Persepolis and the Persian heartland, and there was a sense among the men that they might finally enjoy the fruits of their labors. But Alexander gave them little rest. From the newly conquered cities, he recruited more soldiers, more administrators, more local allies, and began the long trek toward the edges of the known world. The terrain itself began to change. The fertile plains of Mesopotamia gave way to harsher landscapes. The roads were less reliable, the weather less forgiving. Supplies grew harder to secure. The men muttered quietly to one another that perhaps they had gone far enough. Yet Alexander's speeches, always fiery and persuasive, reignited their loyalty. He spoke of glory, of destiny, of the gods themselves guiding them. He reminded them that they were not just soldiers but history-makers, carving out a new world that would be remembered forever. And though they grumbled, most followed still. One of the strangest aspects of this march was Alexander's growing fascination with the exotic and the unknown. He was not content merely to conquer. He wanted to learn, to see, to experience. Along the way, he collected philosophers, scientists, and scribes. He ordered them to record plants, animals, languages, and customs. He was not simply expanding an empire, he was cataloguing a world. For Alexander, the march eastward was not just about territory, but about knowledge. His curiosity, however, was matched by his ruthlessness. Towns and tribes that resisted him were crushed with devastating efficiency. He had little patience for those who defied his vision. At the same time, he showed remarkable tolerance for those who submitted. He married into local nobility, encouraged his men to do the same, and adopted certain foreign customs himself. To some of his Macedonian officers, this was unsettling. They began to whisper that their king was becoming more Persian than Greek, that his hunger for conquest had changed him. Yet Alexander paid them no mind. He believed he was forging a new kind of empire, one that blended East and West into something greater than either. The further east they marched, the stranger the journey became. Alexander encountered nomadic peoples who lived in ways utterly foreign to the Greeks, tribes who roamed with their herds, who built no permanent cities, who seemed to appear and disappear across the vast steppes. Some fought fiercely, unwilling to submit. Others offered their allegiance with gifts of horses, cattle, and guides. Alexander treated each according to their usefulness, rewarding those who aided him and crushing those who opposed him. One particularly challenging stretch of the march took the army through the unforgiving deserts of Central Asia. The sun beat down mercilessly, and water was scarce. Horses collapsed from exhaustion, and men struggled to carry on. In one famous moment, scouts returned with a small helmet filled with water, the only supply they had managed to find after hours of searching. They offered it to Alexander, who looked at the parched faces of his soldiers, then poured the water onto the ground. If his men could not drink, neither would he. The act inspired them to press on, even as their bodies ached and their throats burned. But the challenges were not just physical. Morale became an increasingly difficult issue. Many of the Macedonians had been away from home for years. They missed their families, their farms, their familiar lives. They had already achieved more than any army before them, and they could not understand why Alexander refused to stop. Whispered discontent grew louder. Some officers even considered mutiny. Yet Alexander, with his charisma and his iron will, managed to keep them in line. He reminded them of their victories, their wealth, their place in history. And somehow, they kept marching. The march east was not simply a straight line. Alexander often diverted to chase down rebellions, secure supply lines, or punish those who defied him. Each diversion added weeks, sometimes months, to their journey. Yet he seemed unconcerned with the delays. For him, the march itself was part of the mission, an endless proving ground for his men, a way of testing their loyalty and endurance. Among the strangest encounters of this eastward campaign was with the war elephants of India. To the Greeks and Macedonians, elephants were almost mythical creatures, massive beasts unlike anything they had ever faced in battle. Stories of these animals spread through the ranks long before they saw one, creating both fear and fascination. Alexander, for his part, was eager to meet this challenge. He studied reports, questioned locals, and prepared his men for the possibility of fighting against an enemy that used such strange and powerful animals. When at last they did encounter elephants in battle, the experience was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The elephants thundered across the field, their sheer size and strength scattering horses and men alike. Yet Alexander's discipline and tactics won the day. His men learned to wound the elephants, to cut the tendons in their legs, to attack the drivers perched atop them. It was a brutal, bloody confrontation, but it ended in victory. For Alexander, it was another sign that nothing, not even beasts of such size, could stand in his way. The Indian campaign also brought Alexander into contact with philosophies and religions that fascinated him. He encountered ascetics who lived lives of extreme discipline, renouncing wealth and comfort in pursuit of spiritual truth. These men, sometimes called gymnosophists by the Greeks, impressed Alexander with their calmness and wisdom. He questioned them, debated with them, tried to understand their worldview. Though he was a man of war, there was always a part of him that hungered for knowledge. These encounters broadened his perspective, even as his army grew weary of the endless marching. Yet even in India, Alexander's restless spirit did not quiet. He dreamed of pushing further, of reaching the ends of the earth. He spoke of oceans beyond, of lands uncharted, of peoples still unknown. His men, however, reached their breaking point. At the banks of the Hyphasis River, they refused to go any further. They had marched thousands of miles, fought countless battles, and endured unimaginable hardships. Enough was enough. No amount of speeches, promises, or threats could move them. For the first time in his career, Alexander was forced to turn back. The retreat was not without its own horrors. Rather than retrace their steps along easier routes, Alexander chose to lead his army through the Gedrosian Desert, one of the harshest landscapes imaginable. The decision nearly destroyed his forces. The blazing sun, the lack of water, the endless sand, it all took a devastating toll. Men collapsed by the dozens, animals perished, and supplies dwindled. The desert seemed determined to swallow them whole. And yet, Alexander pressed on, unwilling to admit defeat even to nature itself. The survivors who emerged from that desert would never forget the ordeal. For many, it was worse than any battle they had fought. Yet Alexander seemed almost unshaken, as if even the desert could not break his will. To some, this was inspiring. To others, it was madness. They began to wonder whether their king's ambition would ultimately destroy them all. By the time they returned to more hospitable lands, Alexander's legend had only grown. He was not just a conqueror, but a man who had faced every trial imaginable: enemy armies, strange beasts, harsh deserts, and mutinous soldiers, and had emerged victorious. Yet the cost was high. His army was weary, his officers wary, and his own body was beginning to feel the strain of years of relentless campaigning. Still, his spirit remained restless. Even as he began to consolidate his empire, he spoke of new conquests, new horizons, and new worlds to explore. Chapter 8: Alexander and the Edge of the World. The story of Alexander the Great often feels like a series of restless strides forward, each step carrying him further away from the familiar soil of Macedonia and deeper into lands that seemed to stretch without end. By the time he had marched across Persia, taken Babylon, and placed his banners in the cities of the old empire of Darius, there was a sense that he had already conquered everything worth conquering. To his men, the empire seemed vast enough. To Alexander, however, the horizon was never fixed. Each time he reached it, it retreated further east, beckoning him onward with whispers of lands unseen and people unknown. By the year 327 BCE, he was no longer just the king of Macedon. He was pharaoh of Egypt, lord of Asia, great king of Persia, and the ruler of more territories than any Greek before him could have imagined. Yet, in his heart, the titles were not enough. To stop meant to admit that the limits of the world had been reached, and Alexander refused to believe in limits. He had heard stories, perhaps distorted by travelers and merchants, of India, a land rich with strange animals, spices, philosophers, and vast rivers that dwarfed anything in Greece or Persia. And so, even as his men groaned under the weight of years of marching, Alexander set his gaze eastward, declaring that they would press on until they reached what he liked to call the ends of the earth. The march into the lands beyond Persia was unlike anything his army had yet endured. Persia, though enormous, had been rich with cities, palaces, roads, and supply lines built by the great kings before Darius. India was different. Much of what lay ahead was wild, dense with forests, crossed by rivers that swelled in the monsoon season, and inhabited by tribes that did not surrender their lands as easily as the Persians had. For the first time, Alexander's men faced an environment that seemed to resist their progress at every turn, not just with swords and spears, but with nature itself. The first challenge was the mountains. To reach the Indian subcontinent, Alexander led his forces through the Hindu Kush, a range of peaks so high and forbidding that even the hardiest Macedonian veterans wondered if the gods themselves had erected them as a wall. Snow fell heavily on the narrow passes, and many soldiers, unaccustomed to such bitter cold after years in the sun-drenched plains of Persia, struggled simply to breathe in the thin air. Pack animals slipped on icy paths and tumbled into ravines, carrying precious supplies with them. Men froze in the night, huddling together in their cloaks, only to wake stiff and weakened, yet still commanded to march forward. Alexander himself endured the same conditions, and his presence was often the only thing that kept his army moving. He rode alongside his men, sometimes dismounting to climb a pass on foot, encouraging them by his example. He spoke of the glory that awaited them beyond the mountains, lands fertile and green, rivers broader than seas, and treasures unlike anything they had ever seen. He promised that they would return home not just as soldiers, but as legends, remembered as the first Greeks to set foot in the mysterious lands at the edge of the world. When at last they descended from the icy peaks, they entered the lands of the Punjab, where the climate shifted dramatically. The freezing winds of the mountains gave way to a heavy, suffocating heat. The forests here were dense, filled with the cries of birds the Macedonians had never heard before and the movements of animals that seemed to lurk in the shadows. Soldiers whispered of enormous snakes and strange beasts, and sometimes their whispers proved true. Men who went to fetch water from a stream might return with tales of crocodiles lying in wait, their jaws snapping shut with terrifying speed. At night, campfires glowed dimly under the thick canopy of trees, while unseen creatures howled in the darkness. But the most astonishing sight of all was the elephant. To the Greeks, elephants were creatures of myth more than reality. Some may have heard of them from travelers, but few, if any, had ever seen one. Now, as they marched through India, they saw firsthand the animals that local rulers used as instruments of war. Towering over men and horses, their grey hides like moving walls of flesh, the elephants carried warriors on their backs, their tusks fitted with sharpened tips of iron or bronze. To the Macedonians, who prided themselves on the strength of their phalanx and the charge of their cavalry, the elephants seemed like monsters from another world. Horses panicked at the smell of them, and many men shuddered at the thought of facing them in battle. It was against this backdrop that Alexander faced one of his most famous challenges, the battle against King Porus of the Punjab. Porus was no petty chieftain or minor satrap. He was a tall and imposing ruler, said to have stood over 6 feet in height, a giant by the standards of the time. His kingdom lay between the rivers Jhelum and Chernab, and he commanded an army that included infantry, cavalry, and, most alarmingly for the Macedonians, hundreds of war elephants. When Alexander first encountered Porus, he recognized at once that this would be no easy victory. Porus was a king who knew his land and who commanded the loyalty of his people. He had no intention of bowing to a foreign conqueror, no matter how many lands Alexander had already taken. The two armies met in 326 BCE on the banks of the river Hydaspes, known today as the Jhelum. The river was swollen with rain, its currents strong and treacherous. Porus had stationed his army on the far side, confident that Alexander would not be able to cross without being seen and crushed. For days, the two armies stared at each other across the waters, neither willing to make the first move. Alexander, however, was never one to accept a stalemate. Using his mastery of deception and speed, he devised a plan. While leaving part of his army to maintain a show of force at the main camp, he secretly led a large contingent upstream under the cover of darkness. There, at a bend in the river, he ordered his men to cross. The current was fierce, and men clung to each other to avoid being swept away, but Alexander pressed them on. By dawn, his force had reached the opposite bank, soaked and exhausted, but alive, and ready to surprise Porus. When Porus learned of the crossing, he moved his army swiftly to meet Alexander. What followed was one of the most dramatic battles of Alexander's career. The elephants, with their massive bulk and terrifying trumpets, charged into the Macedonian ranks. Soldiers were trampled underfoot, their spears splintered against the beasts' hides. Horses screamed and bolted, throwing their riders. The air was filled with the clash of steel, the cries of men, and the thunder of elephants as they smashed through the phalanx. Yet Alexander, as always, adapted. He ordered his men to target the elephants' drivers, shooting arrows at the men perched on their backs. Without their riders, the elephants became confused and panicked, trampling friend and foe alike. Alexander himself led a cavalry charge against Porus's horsemen, driving them back with relentless force. The battle raged for hours under the heavy Indian sun, until at last Porus, wounded and weary, surrendered. What happened next became one of the most famous stories of Alexander's career. When the defeated king was brought before him, Alexander asked Porus how he wished to be treated. Porus, bleeding yet unbowed, replied with a single phrase, "Like a king." Alexander, impressed by his courage and dignity, not only spared Porus's life but restored him to his throne, granting him even more territory than before. To Alexander, Porus was not just an enemy defeated, but a man worthy of respect. To his soldiers, it was yet another reminder of their leader's unpredictability, ruthless in battle, yet capable of sudden generosity. But if Alexander had thought the victory at Hydaspes would satisfy his army's hunger for conquest, he was mistaken. For while the battle had proven their strength, it had also shown the terrible cost of fighting in India. The elephants had left a lasting impression of terror, and the endless rivers and jungles ahead filled the soldiers with dread. As they marched further east, rumors spread of even greater kingdoms, of armies larger still, and rivers so wide they seemed like seas. At last, at the banks of the river Hyphasis, known today as the Bees, the army reached its breaking point. Alexander stood before them, declaring his intent to march further east, to cross the river and face whatever lay beyond. But the men, hardened veterans of a decade of war, refused. They had marched from Greece to Asia, through deserts and mountains, across empires, and into lands none of them had ever imagined. Now, with their homes far behind them and their families fading from memory, they demanded an end. They wanted to return west, to enjoy the spoils of their victories, to see their wives and children again. For the first time in his career, Alexander faced open defiance from his men. He argued, he pleaded, he even sulked in his tent, hoping that his silence would bend them to his will. But the army stood firm. They would go no further east. The edge of the world, for them, had been reached. Reluctantly, Alexander agreed. He ordered the construction of 12 great altars by the river, sacrifices to the gods and thanks for their victories and as monuments to the furthest point of their match. Though with heavy heart, he turned his army westward. Chapter 9. The Long Road Home. The air of India was heavy, and though Alexander had triumphed in battle after battle, though he had pushed his army across rivers and through dense forests where the sun barely touched the ground, there was a shift in the spirit of his men. Victories no longer shone with the brilliance of destiny. Instead, they carried with them the weight of exhaustion. The soldiers were seasoned by a decade of constant campaigns, yet their hearts longed for the cities of Macedon, for the soil of Greece, for the quiet lives they had left behind. But Alexander was not yet finished. His dreams, fueled by endless ambition, were like the fires that never went out, always reaching for more. Even when he stood at the banks of the Hyphasis River, known today as the Bees, he gazed eastward toward lands that stretched beyond even rumor. India was vast, and the tales whispered by local guides spoke of kingdoms richer, armies greater, and marvels stranger than anything Greece had ever known. Here, at the Hyphasis, Alexander faced the most formidable obstacle of all, not a Persian army, not a wall of elephants, not even the terrain itself, but his own men. They had followed him from Peller to Egypt, from Egypt to Persia, from Persia into the unknown lands beyond the Indus. But here, the men dug in their heels. They would not go farther. The army, standing on the muddy banks of that river, revolted not with violence but with silence. Their refusal was firm, unmoving. Alexander gathered his commanders, tried to sway them with promises of glory, of riches, of new lands waiting to be conquered. He stood before his men, speaking with the same fire that had rallied them at Issus, at Gaugamela, at the crossing of the Hindu Kush. But the faces that looked back at him were unmoved. They were scarred, weary, sun-darkened from years under unforgiving skies. Their armor was dented, their sandals worn thin. Their eyes said one thing: enough. For perhaps the first time, Alexander's will met a wall he could not breach. He retreated to his tent, brooding for days, refusing to speak to anyone. His pride was wounded, his vision of ruling all the world east to the ocean shattered. At last, however, he emerged and announced what his men had hoped for: they would turn back. The army cheered not as conquerors, but as men who had finally been granted mercy. But Alexander did not give in entirely. If he could not march eastward, he would make the return journey one of conquest and exploration. And so began the long road home, a march that would take the Macedonians through deserts more merciless than any battlefield, across rivers that swallowed men whole, and into lands where even victory tasted of ash. The first leg of the return journey led them back along the Indus River. Alexander chose a path that was not the safest but the most ambitious. He ordered a fleet to be built, hundreds of ships that would sail down the Indus to the Arabian Sea, mapping the waters as they went. The Macedonians were not a seafaring people in the way the Phoenicians or Greeks were, but Alexander believed nothing was impossible for his men. Under his command, carpenters felled trees, smiths hammered nails, and before long, vessels were ready to carry soldiers, supplies, and even siege engines. This fleet was placed under the command of Nearchus, one of Alexander's trusted companions, tasked with navigating the perilous waters and eventually finding a sea route back to Persia. Alexander himself marched along the river banks with part of the army, ensuring that no village resisted their passage. The journey down the Indus was a campaign in its own right. Many tribes resisted. Fortified towns rose along the river, defended by warriors who would not bend easily to a foreign king. Each had to be subdued, and though Alexander was weary, he never showed restraint when resistance flared. Cities were burned, defenders cut down, survivors enslaved. For the Macedonian soldiers, the campaign felt endless, a cycle of fighting, burning, marching, and more fighting. One of the most infamous moments of this march came at the city of Mali. During the siege, Alexander, ever reckless in his courage, scaled the walls himself and leapt into the city ahead of his men. Alone, surrounded by enemies, he fought with fury. But in the chaos, he was struck by an arrow that pierced his lung. The wound was grievous, and as his companions finally stormed the city to rescue him, they found their king on the verge of death. Blood poured from his chest as his men carried him away. News of Alexander's possible death rippled through the army like a storm. Panic spread, and grief turned to despair. The men could not imagine continuing without him. For days he hovered between life and death, but his spirit, stubborn as iron, did not yield. He recovered, slowly, and when he could stand once more, he demanded to be shown to his army. Propped up, pale and weakened, Alexander appeared before his men, and a roar of relief echoed across the camp. Their king lived, and for all their weariness, they would follow him still. As the army pressed on, Alexander's thoughts were divided. He dreamed of returning to Babylon, of consolidating the empire he had built, but he also burned with ideas of new campaigns, into Arabia, perhaps even into the Western Mediterranean. He was a man who could not rest, for rest to him felt like death. Yet the further west they marched, the harsher the journey became. When at last they reached the shores of the Arabian Sea, Alexander split his forces. Nearchus would take the fleet by sea, exploring the coastline and searching for a safe passage to the Persian Gulf. Alexander himself chose a far more dangerous path, leading part of the army through the Jedrosian Desert, one of the most desolate wastelands on Earth. It was a decision that has puzzled historians ever since. The desert offered no easy passage, no resources, only endless dunes of sand, scorching heat by day and bitter cold by night. Perhaps Alexander wished to test himself and his army, to prove that even nature could not defeat them. Perhaps he simply miscalculated. Whatever the reason, the crossing became one of the greatest ordeals his army ever faced. The Jedrosian Desert stretched before them like an ocean of death. Supplies quickly dwindled. Wells were few, and many dried up before the army reached them. Men collapsed from thirst, their tongues swollen, their skin cracked from the heat. Horses and pack animals died by the thousands, their carcasses left to rot under the merciless sun. Food ran scarce, and the soldiers resorted to eating whatever they could find: roots, scraps, sometimes even the leather of their own sandals. One story, often told, captures the spirit of that march. A group of soldiers, after hours of searching, managed to gather a small amount of water in a helmet. They brought it to Alexander, their king, offering him relief in the middle of that hell. But Alexander, looking at the parched faces of his men, refused to drink. Instead, he poured the water into the sand before them all, declaring that if his men could not drink, neither would he. That act of shared suffering restored what strength the men had left. They staggered onward, inspired by the king who would not claim comfort while his soldiers suffered. Still, the cost was terrible. Of the tens of thousands who entered the desert, many never emerged. Those who did were gaunt, their armor hanging loose on their shrunken frames, their eyes hollow. Yet Alexander, impossibly, endured, still dreaming of the future. By the time the army finally emerged from the desert, ragged and broken, the men longed not for conquest but simply for survival. Yet even then, Alexander did not grant them rest. He pushed them toward new campaigns, new projects, new visions. His restlessness was a force of nature, one that could not be contained. The long road home was not a return to peace but a march into another kind of battle, against time, exhaustion, and the limits of human endurance. And though the men did not yet know it, their king's own time was running short. Chapter 10: The End of Alexander. The story of Alexander the Great, so often told in terms of his battles, his conquests, his restless ambition, eventually narrows to a single, quiet, haunting question: how does a man who sought to rule the entire world come to an end? For years, Alexander had driven his armies across continents, from the plains of Macedon to the mountains of Persia, across deserts, and finally into the thick jungles and rivers of India. But even the greatest conquerors, who bend nations and kingdoms to their will, cannot escape the slow approach of mortality. By the time he turned back from India, the shadow of exhaustion, both physical and spiritual, hung over his men and, though he tried to ignore it, over Alexander himself. When he returned to Babylon in 323 BC, he was just 32 years old. 32, and already spoken of as a living god, already ruler of an empire stretching farther than any before him. Babylon, ancient and glittering, stood at the heart of Mesopotamia, with its massive walls, its rivers, its temples to gods older than the Greeks themselves. It was here that Alexander made his final base, his palace, his stage. And it was here that the strange omens began to gather. Reports spread that the Babylonian priests had warned him not to enter the city. They said the stars had spoken of disaster, that the gates would swallow him, that death hovered near. Alexander, never one to bow to superstition, dismissed these words. He had faced armies larger than his, storms at sea, near mutinies, assassination plots, and still he had survived. Why should he fear the predictions of men reading the heavens? And yet, some said that, rather than enter through the great gates, he chose a smaller entrance, as if part of him wished to trick fate itself. Inside Babylon, Alexander set about reshaping the city into the center of his empire. He issued grand plans, an immense harbor, new temples, a road system to bind together east and west. He spoke of campaigns yet to come, into Arabia, perhaps even beyond, into lands unimagined by his soldiers. But beneath this show of energy, there was a sense of unease. His men were tired. They had marched for over a decade, seen brothers fall in battle, endured hunger and heat and endless campaigns. Though they respected their king, whispers grew louder. Would there ever be an end? Would Alexander ever let them go home? The omens worsened. A crown placed upon the head of a statue of Apollo supposedly fell to the ground. A lion, kept as a royal pet, was said to have been mauled to death by a donkey, an absurd, unsettling symbol of the high brought low. One day, as Alexander walked the palace corridors, a man sat silently upon the throne itself. Startled and angry, Alexander demanded to know what he was doing. The man said nothing, offering no defense, no explanation. The seers who were brought forward declared that this was a dire sign, that the throne itself would soon be left empty. Still, Alexander pressed forward. In June of 323 BC, he hosted a great banquet for his companions. Wine flowed freely, music and laughter filled the halls. Accounts differ on what happened next, and from these differences comes one of history's great mysteries. Some say Alexander drank deeply, more than usual, and was suddenly struck by pain in his belly. Others say he was poisoned, that conspirators, angry generals, resentful courtiers, even those close to him, sought his death. Another version has him falling ill with fever, perhaps from malaria, perhaps from typhoid. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Alexander, invincible in battle, began to weaken. Over the days that followed, he lay upon his bed in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, sweating, shivering, unable to rise. His commanders came to his side, asking for orders, for clarity, for reassurance. He could barely speak. His voice, once commanding and confident, was reduced to whispers. Still, when he could, he made gestures, giving signs that he still intended to lead, that his plans had not ended. But as the days passed, it became undeniable. The soldiers who had marched with him from Macedon demanded to see their king. The palace doors were opened, and one by one, they filed past him, thousands of men who had followed him across the world. They looked down at his wasted face, his burning eyes, and many wept. Alexander, unable to speak, lifted his hand weakly in greeting. It was said to be one of the most moving scenes of his life, not the battles, not the triumphs, but this final farewell between king and army. Then came the question that would haunt history. To whom did Alexander leave his empire? When pressed, when asked who would inherit, he is said to have whispered only, "Heir to the strongest." Others claimed he named his unborn child, or perhaps his half-brother. The truth is uncertain, muddled by time and legend. But what is certain is that, in leaving such an empire without clear direction, he set the stage for chaos. On June 10th, 323 BC, Alexander the Great died. 32 years old. Dead not on the battlefield, not struck down by an enemy's sword, but on a bed in Babylon, weakened by fever, or by poison, or perhaps by the weight of destiny itself. His body, it was said, showed no sign of decay for days after death. To his followers, this was proof of his divinity, that he was more than mortal. His generals, meanwhile, argued and schemed. Where would his body be buried? In Macedon, with his ancestors? In Babylon, the heart of his empire? Or in Egypt, the land he had claimed as a god? Ptolemy, one of his closest companions, ensured the latter, seizing the body and bringing it to Alexandria, where it would rest in a golden sarcophagus for centuries, visited by emperors, admired by kings. But Alexander's death left more than a body. It left an empire without a center, a storm without a calm. His generals, the so-called Diadochi, carved up the world between them. Wars erupted, cities were destroyed, families torn apart. The unity Alexander had built, the dream of a world ruled as one, dissolved into blood and ambition. And yet, his legend only grew. Stories spread of his conquests, his impossible marches, his moments of rage and mercy, his belief in destiny. In Greece, in Rome, in the Far East, he became a symbol, sometimes of greatness, sometimes of hubris. His name was remembered not only by historians but by poets, by travelers, by dreamers who imagined what it would be like to walk in his footsteps. For in the end, Alexander the Great did not simply conquer lands. He conquered memory. He made himself unforgettable. And though his empire crumbled, though his line ended, though his men scattered, the idea of Alexander lived on. Even now, centuries later, his story is told, sometimes as history, sometimes as myth, sometimes as a cautionary tale. Was he a hero, bringing unity and vision to a divided world? Or was he a destroyer, dragging men across continents for his own restless ambition? The truth lies somewhere between. But what is certain is that his life, and his death, remind us of the limits of even the greatest among us. That no man, no matter how brilliant, no matter how powerful, can hold the world forever. And so we return, at the close of this long tale, to the quiet image, Alexander, once the thunder of armies, the conqueror of kings, lying silent in Babylon, watched over by his soldiers, his voice fading, his body stilled. The world he had sought to rule moved on, but his name remained. And perhaps, in that, he achieved what he wanted most, not just to live, not just to conquer, but to be remembered, always, as Alexander.